it makes it very difficult for those clubs to compete with the established elite. The unusual nature of treating players as commodities. For all we know, that might disappear. We will have a Wild West in terms of what happens in football.
That's almost like the lifesaver for this season, potentially. Will Newcastle actually have any money to spend now? Have they got the capability to maybe spend some money this summer and not have immediate concerns?
Alright, it's your Geordie Journos for a quite regular Saturday video now. Of course, only one Geordie Journal here for this video, I think anyway. I'm kind of just doing a little bit of an introduction because I've got a bit of a special interview coming up that will run through around 30 to 40 minutes of some really interesting financial stuff from the main man, the only man, the football finance expert, the always brilliant Kieran Maguire. I used to speak to Kieran a lot through the takeover process when I was working for the Shields Gazette in Dom's role, which he is now. And Kieran was a constant source of amazing analysis and information, sharing a lot of details with regards the finances of how things are going. And again, so I reached out to him to see if we could get a little bit of finance clarity after what's felt like a chaotic month or so with, of course, that June the 30th PSR deadline. With the sales, and a lot of fans then kind of came to us, having done videos on that, asking what next, how much have Newcastle got to spend, can they even spend any money, is PSR going to become a yearly problem, or is this now the panic over? So I've done a half an hour 40-minute video with Kieran Maguire, hopefully answering a lot of those questions that you guys might have. Now that is coming up in a couple of seconds, but I first got to run through the T's and C's. If you like the content that we do, like, comment, share and subscribe. There is a little thanks button down there that you can donate to the channel for this kind of content. It helps us improve our content moving forward. Also, you can catch us on a Monday evening on Shots TV if you don't get enough of on YouTube. Of course, like I said, like, comment, share and subscribe. Click the bell if you like to have our content brought straight to your devices. And finally, one for the sponsors. Four Rivers will be in the corner somewhere, and it'll definitely be in the bio below as well. So do check them out if you've got any pension or investment advice needed in your life. Okay, I hope this answers a few questions for you. Let us know in the comments if it does, even if it doesn't. And we might be able to do something like this again later in the summer. Cheers, guys, and thanks for watching. But I must say, stick around to the very end to find out exactly what Kieran says on budgets. It is worth waiting for. Cheers.
Right, it's been a tumultuous few weeks at Newcastle United. Finance is always on the agenda when it comes to Newcastle United, and who better to get somebody in to talk about the context around the madness of football finance than Kieran Maguire himself, football finance expert, academic, author, broadcaster. Anything else, Kieran?
Granddad. That's my most important role in life, I can assure you.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. Right, shall we start at the beginning? It's been a remarkable journey at Newcastle United. Very much, I think one thing that fans are finding at the moment is a little bit of confusion because Newcastle United have in many ways painted themselves out since the majority takeover by PIF has been whiter than white, making sure we fit every criteria possible, will not break spending, will be very careful in everything that they do. I think June the 30th kind of blew a lot of people's minds with regards to that kind of policy. I mean, what did you make of the PSR calculations? And we'll come on to the complex nature of all that kind of thing later on in the call. But what did you make of the June the 30th thing? It wouldn't have been much of a surprise to you, I suppose, given the research and the finances that you've got a hold of at the moment.
I didn't think Newcastle were in a terrible position the 30th of June 2024. But at the same time, I was aware that they probably had to do nothing. For people unfamiliar with the rules, you can only lose £105 million over 3 years. Now, in 2022, Newcastle United lost effectively £150 million, but you can make various adjustments and tweaks and so on. So I suspected they had to make some form of adjustment to sort of claw back some of the issues, but it wasn't a huge driver. And clubs had come to terms with the fact that if you sell academy players, or if you sell young players that you've bought for low fees for high fees, you can generate far greater profits than selling the likes of Bruno or Isaac and so on. And also, you're keeping the tried and tested stars at the club. So I think that was the strategy the club decided to apply. For all of the faults of Mike Ashley, and let's face it, we could do a separate 2-hour special which just dealt with all of the faults of Mike Ashley. The one thing that he did do, as far as the new owners was concerned, is that he left them in a very strong PSR situation, and that's allowed the wage bill to substantially increase. It doubled between 2021 and 2023, for example. It's allowed significant investment in talent, but you can't do that forever unless the money coming into the club rapidly increases as well. So that's where we were. So I was expecting something as far as Newcastle United was concerned, but then I was expecting something from quite a few other clubs as well. I was asked by one of the sort of the national media organisations to analyse 6 clubs that they felt were close to the wind, and those 6 clubs were Newcastle, Villa, Leicester, Forest, Everton, and Chelsea. So clearly, they did the broadcasters or the media outlets had either been briefed by the clubs or they'd done their own sums, because people sometimes follow the nerds on social media, such as myself and Swiss Ramble and Stephen Borson. So it was on the cards that something had to be done. I think the route that the club took was an interesting one.
Interesting in many ways, because what it did was basically pluck 2 of the most promising players that people were really looking forward to seeing out of the system at Newcastle United. Of course, your club, Brighton, scored for one of them, and Yankuba Minte. I know a lot of Newcastle United fans were upset that they never really got to see him in a black and white shirt, when they never got to see him at all. But I think the one that really stuck in people's throat the most was that Elliot Anderson one that we'd seen 50 games or so of him in a black and white shirt. He'd shown a lot of promise, had never quite seen the real Elliot Anderson, and it's a shame that almost football finance now, such as its prominence, means players like that have become assets rather than actual talent, and can be easily traded to make sure that the balance sheets all marry up to not necessarily being profitable. It's just what the Premier League see as sustainable.
Yes, I can understand the frustration of Newcastle fans, because the way that the rules have been created, and the Premier League often talks about something called unintended consequences. That's the constant criticism that the Premier League has with regards, for example, to the proposals for an independent regulator in football. Well, one of the unintended consequences of the introduction of the PSR rules in their present form is that clubs that I would describe as an outsider, and I've not got a dog in the fight on this particular issue, is that a club which I would classify as aspirational stroke ambitious, and in my view, the 2 clubs that stand out in that regard as far as the Premier League is concerned are Newcastle United and Aston Villa. It makes it very difficult for those clubs to compete with the established elite. Because if you've got a club which has an existing, if we take a look at Newcastle United, their income in 2023 was £250 million. That of Manchester City was over 700 million. So Manchester City have got a £450 million head start. That gives clubs of that stature a lot of leeway. And it therefore makes it very challenging. You have to be a lot smarter than those big clubs. And Manchester City are a very smart club, and Liverpool are a very smart club as well when it comes to talent spotting and player development and so on. So one of the unintended consequences, or was it an unintended consequence? I mean, that's a separate issue. In my view, the rules were very much geared to looking after the best interests of those clubs who were established at the top table of the Premier League and also in Europe. It's frustrating. you're not seeing some of those other clubs having to sell their talent to the same extreme as Newcastle United on a percentage basis. And you can understand why fans are railing against what we now see as something which was introduced under the name financial fair play. And I think a lot of people probably fell for the line fair to think, okay, well, this will give everybody not necessarily a purely level playing field, but an opportunity to be competitive. And that's certainly not the case.
I think moving it forward a little bit from the issues that have happened this summer, whether big or small or anywhere in between, is I think one of the biggest fears that Newcastle United fans have. And I know, just to caveat this, you're not au fait with the exacts. That's the hardest part about this, is it's impossible to know. There are so many nuances to how these calculations are done, etc. But I think the biggest thing that Newcastle United fans have is, will this become a regular thing? Are we talking about, there's a lot of talk with the 3-year cycles, yearly cycles almost, with one dropping off and one coming on. Is this going to be a June the 30th mad rush for a club like Newcastle United on a regular basis, or was this just the one-off?
No, I think this could become a regular feature. We saw in 2022, we saw Everton sell Richarlison to Spurs because they knew that they were under pressure with regards to the 3 years to the 30th of June that year. They claim that they sold Richarlison at an undervalue. With Nottingham Forest in 2023, with the sale of somebody who's referred to as Player A, if you take a look at the actual commission reports, but his mum and dad refer to him as Brennan, in terms of having to sell that player to Spurs, but they were given an offer of selling the player to Spurs for £30 million. So for selling the player to, I think it was Milan, for £30 million on the 30th of June. They felt that wasn't enough money, and they subsequently sold him for £45 million. So it has been knocking around. I think what we have seen is, by the time we've got to 2024, clubs such as Villa and Newcastle. I've got Newcastle's accounts in front of me here. The net spend for 2022 and 2023, which were effectively the first sort of 18 months of the PIF acquisition of the club, was £292 million. Yeah, that's a hell of a lot of money. And therefore, at some point, you're going to have to change that trading model to make sure that you've got more money coming in, as well as money going out. So I do think it's likely to be repeated. Having said that, I anticipate a change to the PSR rules from 25-26, and how things move on from there, we'll have to wait and see. But it's likely to mirror what we have as far as UEFA is concerned, which is something which also reinforces the existing gaps and the existing hierarchy within football, but it's a different flavour of calculation.
That's one of the interesting things that we hear so much about changes. Then you'll all of a sudden, when there's an announcement that there might be changes, there's an excitement, a buzz around football saying, right, this is it. The glass ceiling is about to be broken through. And then all of a sudden, the devil becomes in the detail, and it's just more of the same. I think in layman's terms, that kind of feels like what the alignment between UEFA and even the slightly expanded Premier League new propositions would be.
Yes, from what we can make out, I think there was a feeling perhaps that with the collapse of Super League Mark 1, we would have a perhaps more what you might call democratic, a more open playing field in terms of new clubs with new owners with money being competitive, because what we had seen over the course of the last decade is that the elite clubs have used Super League, or the threat of Super League, to extract more and more more and more compromises and more money from the smaller clubs. It was always, well, unless you give us more of the international TV deals, we go off and join Super League. unless you create something called a 10-year coefficient. So if you get knocked out of the Champions League early, you can still get money from the last 9 years. We'll go off and use our own Super League. Those big clubs played that card. It failed, but it is still lurking in the shadows, I can assure you. You've only got to take a look at the comments from Jim Ratcliffe, the new owner of Manchester United. He describes Super League as an initiative. He's also started saying that he doesn't believe in one club, one vote when it comes to the Premier League, i.e. he wants a voting structure which benefits the larger clubs, the established elite and so on, over some of the other clubs. So I wasn't hugely surprised that the latest manifestation of the rules from UEFA, which are likely to be mirrored by the Premier League, are still very much stacked to the advantage of the existing, I don't want to call them super clubs because there's nothing super about them in my view because of the way that they behave, but the usual suspects, shall we say.
It's quite a sport by nature is meant to be almost in many ways a level playing field. It's never going to be a level playing field when you've got so much history, heritage, etc., and finance essentially throughout the years. But it does feel even more difficult now, doesn't it, for any football club, whether that be a new takeover in the Championship that may suddenly decide that they want to become for example, a Leeds. If Leeds decided that the finance was there with a Red Bull link up, etc., and decided, right, this is going to be our future. We're going to try and challenge back to where we believe Leeds should be. There is a number of glass ceilings in place in the Premier League. Not only is it difficult to break into the top half of the Premier League, but breaking into that top four has almost become. I know Newcastle did it, then Aston Villa did it, but they've almost broken the norm, really, over the course of the last 2 decades.
You're absolutely right, Liam. I think I'm not taking anything away from the achievements from Newcastle or Villa. They both did that on merit. But it also has to be observed that some of the other clubs had a stinker of a year. And if we go back again to 2016, when Leicester City won the Premier League, as a neutral fan, I was absolutely delighted. But that was the perfect storm of Manchester City being in transition in terms of managers and player recruitment. They were also operating under some restrictions from UEFA. Manchester United were going through some own manager issues. Liverpool, again, they messed up. They lost their manager effectively on the back of that, and everything worked perfectly for Leicester. And it was very, very rare. It's a bit like me dating Taylor Swift. It ain't going to happen too often, but you always live in hope at the start of the season. So I think that there's a genuine problem. I'm old enough to remember Derby County, Nottingham Forest, Aston Villa, Everton, Leeds United, Blackburn Rovers, even Arsenal, all winning the top tier of English football on merit, because at the start of the season, the players were roughly all around about paid the same. Nobody had a budget which was truly outstanding, and therefore on the back of that, sorry about this. On the back of that, clubs were able to win trophies. I can remember Ipswich Town, Southampton winning the FA Cup. Well, who wins the FA Cup every year this year?
Same teams.
It's the same teams who are also winning the Premier League. And that's not to take away from the fact that they've got some fantastic coaches. Everybody knows that Pep Guardiola and Jurgen Klopp are brilliant at what they do, but they certainly have a benefit over the vast majority of the other clubs in the Premier League as well. And how do you make those clubs competitive? If we've got Manchester City, we've got Manchester United, and we've got Chelsea, each of whom have squads that cost over £1 billion to put together. And then with Nottingham Forest promoted 2 seasons ago with a squad that cost 12 million, 1% of the cost of the established elite. That's just how difficult things are as far as having a competitive product. The broadcasters don't care, because the broadcasters know that their viewing figures are actually higher when it's the big clubs playing, or the sneaky six, whatever you want to call them. So the rest of the media seems perfectly happy with that as well. The international fan bases, which are dominated by those clubs, they're perfectly happy because they just want to see their teams win. So trying to find a genuine ability to put forward an alternative which is perhaps more in line with what we see, ironically, with American franchise sports, the likes of the NFL and the NBA and so on, which are level playing fields and are designed for that purpose, is really difficult. And also, you've got to give credit to Liverpool and Manchester United and Arsenal and so on, because they were the driving force in terms of the interest in the Premier League. Although I think it could be argued that Newcastle United, 20 odd years ago under Kevin Keegan, they were pretty similar themselves. They were a team that everybody liked to watch, and it could have been, if they were at the right place at the right time, that they could have been one of the big six themselves. But things didn't work out.
I think it's easily forgotten. It seems like so long ago, but it is. Newcastle at that time, late 90s, were one of the biggest revenue drivers on the planet. And it seems, you look at the numbers now compared to then, and it's minuscule. Football is, I think that's what I was looking back, and we mentioned him earlier. I try not to mention him by name too much, but Mike Ashley, if you look at that period, it was almost a period of exponential growth in football when Newcastle United was stood with their hands in their pockets for the whole period, where clubs around them and below them were growing consistently.
That's right. If you take a look at Newcastle United in the season when Mike Ashley arrived, it's not being critical of either Newcastle or the clubs I'm about to mention. I would have probably had them on a par with Spurs and Manchester City in terms of they weren't dominating. In fact, they were ahead of Manchester City. Manchester City had been down as far as League One, as we know, but it's still a big city club. So it always had potential to sell out the grounds, and it's got a loyal fan base in the same way as the other clubs that I mentioned. But under 13 years of Mike Ashley, the commercial growth at Manchester City grew by a factor of 10. The commercial growth at Spurs probably grew by a factor of 6, and the commercial growth of Newcastle United flatlined. And those were lost years. We're not here to talk about the Lord Voldemort of Tyneside.
I could call him worse.
I'm being polite here, you see. But I honestly think that was a lost opportunity. He became a toxic brand, and therefore, in the eyes of partners, sponsors, and so on, Newcastle suffered on the back of that. And now what Newcastle United have to do is to play catch up, and try to play catch up as fast as they can, because fans are impatient. As we all know, 2 weeks in football is a hell of a long time. Well, if you say, if Newcastle continue this level of growth, I reckon by the end of the decade, that big six will be a big seven with a degree of certainty. Fans will say, well, we'd rather not wait that long, and you can understand that viewpoint.
Yeah. It's interesting. Going back to the PSR thing, and I know it's difficult for you to answer in any kind of minute detail, really, but one thing that seems to blow people's minds is how these calculations are brought about, how things are deducted. Because I remember we were invited in January to speak to Darren Eales, the chairman and the chief financial officer, etc., and we were presented with the finances bare as they looked, and my immediate reaction was, wow, Newcastle United have broken PSR here. Like, is this what we're going to be talking about? I think, in layman's terms, a normal fan cannot get their head around the idea of what PSR is. And I think that during the 30th deadline, one thing that was brought about was a lot of talk of Newcastle United are looking to sign this £30 million player, but also that they're having to sell, a certain player for 30, another one for 35, and how could you buy somebody and it not count towards that year, but the sale would? It's very complex.
It is. It's due to the vagaries of the accounting system, in that if you sell a player, 100% of the profits arise immediately. But if you buy a player, the cost of the transfer is effectively calculated on a daily basis over the life of the contract. So if you sign a player on the 30th of June, you've got, for say £50 million on a 5-year contract, you go 50 divided by 5, well, that's £10 million a year, 365 days in the year. It's probably about 28 grand worth of amortization. You see, I still do my Nintendo brain training on a regular
that
basis.
was very impressive.
Which for an old man, that's what you have to do. That's what you have to do, I'm afraid. So it costs you 28. It costs you 28 grand, and at the same time, you can be realizing a profit. So the accounting rules, which are consistent with every other business in every other industry, by the way. So we're not singling out football. It's just the unusual nature of treating players as commodities. And for all we know, that might disappear because there's a test case about to go to one of the senior European courts, which has been brought about by the old Bosman lawyer, which, if successful, could mean that the transfer system cannot be applied, and then we will have a Wild West in terms of what happens in football. I'm not necessarily sure that if this claim is successful, it's going to be good for football, but it's going to keep you and me busy.
Yeah, definitely makes things interesting. I want to do a little bit of myth busting with you. I've seen certain things online, suggestions either way on these type of things, and it's to do with the accounting periods and what counts and when. So Newcastle United obviously saw a major uplift in the amount of money coming in through the door last season with regards to the Champions League, and also increased shirt sponsorship deals and Adidas coming on board, etc. Do we have any idea about when those that money is set to drop? Because I know that was one of the concerns about people coming up to that June the 30th deadline, was like, wait there, did the Champions League money already count, and we're still potentially £60 million behind where we should be?
Yeah, the Champions League very much counts because Newcastle United earned that in the period, the 1st of July 2023 to the 30th of June 2024. You've got to look at not just inputs, but also outputs. Sir Alan Sugar, who again is somebody that he splits opinions, I'll politely say. One thing that he's always got right is he describes the football industry as a bit like drinking pure prune juice. Now, for anybody who's young and probably doesn't know what a prune is, let alone prune juice has the impact on your body of whatever you've just eaten at one end tends to come out at the other end quite rapidly. And that's what we've seen as far as the football industry is concerned. So Newcastle probably earns somewhere in the region of 35 million pounds from participation in the Champions League last season. And that will be a combination of the money they got from UEFA, additional kick-ins as far as sponsors were concerned, and the fact that you had an additional 3 matches at St James's Park, which probably brought in the region of £2.5 million in matchday revenue. Against that, all of the players and the management staff will have had clauses in their contract which says, should we qualify for the Champions League, we get the following bonuses. Yeah. And those bonuses eat up. So I think it's folly to just look at the top line. And in the world of finance, we have a very smug and self-satisfying comment which says, revenue is vanity, profit is sanity. And I think all of the focus is on the revenue. And it's nice to be able to say, yes, we're getting an extra X million pounds from this and that. So in terms of UEFA competition, extra money coming in, Newcastle got all of it, but a lot of that will have been absorbed in terms of bonuses. Then you've got additional costs of hosting the matches. You've got your additional accommodation, transport costs, insurance costs. All of these things eat into the bottom line. As far as Adidas is concerned, that deal effectively comes into play from the 24-25 season. So even if Adidas had paid an advance to Newcastle in terms of cash, and I'm not necessarily sure they will have done that, it won't count towards PSR until the date of the contract kicks in.
Right, so that's almost like the lifesaver for this season, potentially, with possibly a couple more sales this time next year as well, as you mentioned earlier. Another one, there's been some movement this week as well with regards to Newcastle United, and we've seen a steady and slow dilution of the percentage that PCP Capital Partners, Amanda Stavely and Mehrdad Gadusi have at Newcastle United. I think the last calculation was down to around 5.7%, I think. It was kind of expected that this would happen, but how are you viewing that? How is the outside football world viewing this change in dynamic? Because although Amanda Stavely was the broker of the deal, she was very much the public face, the person in Premier League meetings. She was the person who stood up and almost gave PIF a valid face, basically, of Newcastle United to the outside world, whereas that's kind of not there anymore. How's the football world viewing this?
I don't think there's a huge amount of surprise. I think it's fairly well known that Amanda Stavely, she is asset rich, but perhaps cash poor would be the way I would describe it. Yeah, the very fact that she had to borrow money from Mike Ashley to pay for certain things, if rumours are true, is indicative of that. PIF have the capacity to put a lot of cash into Newcastle United. Amanda Stavely doesn't. That still means that she's still far wealthier than you or I can ever dream of being. But against PIF, it's pebbles against boulders. And therefore, what her role would have been going forwards, I think there was a degree of uncertainty. You're absolutely right, Liam. She has been the public face of Newcastle United, and I think that's helped PIF over the course of the 3 years, or we've got 2.5 years that we've had to date, because she's always at matches. She's always got a black and white scarf on. She's seen as sort of, I don't think legitimizing is the appropriate word, because if you take a look at Sheikh Mansour at Manchester City, I think he's been to watch them twice in 15 years. But I think it's of localizing the interest as in the club and the investment in the club. That couldn't continue forever. I suspect what's happened is that PIF have given her an option which is too good to turn down, and therefore she's decided to take it. Now, she could have done the same and still remained at board level, but it could be that she's got other interests in life. She might want to focus on those. Clearly she's got a lot of experience in the Middle East, and it's been felt by all parties. Darren Eales has now had an opportunity to get his feet under the desk, to come to terms with the size of the task at Newcastle United. And on the back of that, there's now going to be a fairly seamless transfer of power. There's no reason why owners have to be involved. You don't see the Glazers ever turning up at meetings as far as Manchester United is concerned. It's the same with John Henry at Liverpool. I'm a Brighton fan. Everything there is delegated to Paul Barber. If you've got a good chief executive who understands the business, and the role of the chief executive is to put into action the strategy and the desires of the owner, then I think that's a way to go forward. So I think this is, to a certain extent, it's as much a vote of confidence in Darren Eales as it is an opportunity for Amanda Stavely to move on. And I'm sure she goes with the best wishes of all Newcastle United fans, because it has been a transformative period of time as far as the club is concerned, and the level of positivity about the club is unrecognisable. I've been to the ground as a Brighton fan under the Ashley era and under PIF, two different clubs as far as the fan base is concerned. The level of enthusiasm, people looking forward to matches rather than it doesn't. I'm trying not to be too melodramatic here, but I got the impression under Ashley it was a bit like going to visit a sick relative. You still love them, but you didn't particularly want to be there.
I like that analogy. I think it actually really ticks that box perfectly. That's very much what I felt like. Even as a journalist, you almost knew the end result before you went, but you had to go anyway and just endure rather than enjoy. I know you're a very busy man. you're almost every TV screen or every radio. Every time I turn the radio on, I hear your voice somewhere. So I do want to ask you this, and you know the game. I've saved this question right to the end to keep people interested all the way through if they weren't already. This is what most people are asking at the moment. We've had the June the 30th deadline. We've had PSR. All that seems to be back burner for the time being. Will Newcastle actually have any money to spend now? Have they got the capability to maybe spend some money this summer and not have immediate concerns?
Yeah, without doubt, they've got money to spend. I mean, I think what people perhaps don't realise is that the profits from the sales of the two players and whatever money they got from the move of Dan Ashworth to Manchester United, that goes into not only settling any outstanding issues for 23-24, but it's part of the 3-year pot as far as 24-25 is concerned. So they are in a strong position. They are able to be competitive. And remember, it's as much to do with perhaps being able to offer some of the existing squad an extension on their contract. Now, an extension on contract is football speak is for a decent pay rise to stop thinking about go to the bright lights of the Northwest or London as anything else. And therefore, yeah, I don't see why Newcastle cannot be active as far as the transfer market is concerned. I think what Newcastle fans perhaps have to accept going forwards is that it's not just the indoor that will be the focus of attention, but the exit door has to be taken into account as well. And again, I'm looking at the numbers here. Player sales in 2021, 2 million, 2022, 7 million, 2023, 3 million. So, sales of £12 million over 3 seasons, that's not going to work for anybody. It was a transformative period of time as far as the club is concerned, and the club has transformed, but it now has to operate on more of not necessarily a one in, one out basis, but a more balanced approach as far as talent recruitment and retention is concerned.
So I think it sounds like there is going to be money, but there has to be almost a change in direction as to what we've seen. That was the first period of where it was bring Newcastle United up to a level. Now it's got to be a sort of in and out where it's got to be trading is going to become even more key if you go to almost bridge the gap to the teams above you.
That's right. I think what we've seen is we've had the rocket burners on for 3 seasons, and now we're going into orbit. We're starting to plateau a little bit. I'd still expect net spend to be positive on an annual basis, but not to be at the same level as those past 3 seasons. £41 million in 2021, and that was with the owners are only in for 1 window. Then 142 million followed by 150. Those numbers are not sustainable on a long-term basis for any club, and that includes some of the more stellar clubs. And I can understand Newcastle fans saying, well, what about Chelsea? But nobody dislikes Chelsea more than I do as a Brighton fan. We loathe Chelsea. We actually dislike Chelsea more than we dislike Crystal Palace. It's a bit like a Newcastle fan finding that they dislike a club more than they dislike Sunderland. It's that bad, and we've hated it.
Why is that? May I ask? Because of the trade and it's happened recently.
They've taken 13 members of staff.
Yeah.
And it has become farcical. They've taken the manager, but not just the manager, the goalkeeping coach, the number 2, all of Graham Potter's team. That lasted 6 months. Our player of the season went, Cucurella, who'd been the player of the season effectively the previous season. He went as well after he discovered that apparently since childhood, this is unusual for a kid from Spain, his dream was to go to Chelsea and play for them. So
that's very believable.
Yeah, very believable indeed. Yes. I will be. I'm fortunate enough to be going to Berlin on Sunday to watch England versus Spain. I will be cheering on England, of course, because that's the right thing to do. But I'll be booing Cucurella's every touch, along with all of the German fans who felt that he conceded a penalty. So Newcastle fans are saying, well, what about Chelsea? They've spent an absolute fortune. Chelsea have played the game. They've sold hotels and car parks to themselves. They've had some unusual transfers and player swaps, which weren't quite swaps, but just happened to move academy players elsewhere. And also, to give Chelsea some credit, and as much as I'm loath to do this, Chelsea have been the most successful club over the course of the last decade in terms of selling players at huge profits. You think about Eden Hazard. Yeah, they sold him for well over 100 million to Real Madrid. And he stank out Madrid for years. But also the likes of, they sold Gray Hughes, now playing for Palace. He came from Chelsea Academy. Pure profit. Tammy Abrahams, Mason Mount. All of these players have gone for tens and tens of millions, which has allowed Chelsea actually to be in a better position than perhaps people have realised, because all of the focus as always is on the indoor.
Yeah, there's a couple of Newcastle United have scored for a couple of Tino Livramento was at Chelsea, and Lewis Hall this summer, £25 million straight in the back pocket for Chelsea when I think he'd started 7 Premier League games up until last season. So it just shows the sort of the reliance on Cobham effectively to keep Chelsea bankrolled and going on, unless you've got hotels to sell, which I don't think Newcastle United have got any of them. It's definitely not at London prices anyway.
No.
But I appreciate it. Kieran, is there anything that you want to plug at all that you're involved in at the moment? Or
well, if anybody is interested in any of this football finance nonsense, I do a podcast called The Price of Football with comedian Kevin Day, and we can't work out why it's popular, but it does seem to be popular. It's listened to, from what we understand, in a huge number of clubs up and down the country, mainly because staff fear that they might be featured. Like most news stories, that for every one good story, there's probably 5 or 6 wrong ones to talk about. But we go out 2 or 3 times a week, and on the back of that, sort of the profile of football finances had increased, which is, I guess, it's good for me career-wise. I've now got a Wikipedia page. It's absolutely dreadful for my marriage because I'm doing this 365 days a year.
I'm not surprised. I'd be so tempted to change things on the Wikipedia page as well, just to fluff your own reputation up.
If only I had the time.
Yeah, I bet. No, it's been really good having you on, Kieran, and we'll have to not keep it so long next time to get you on, if you can fit it in somewhere. But it's much appreciated.
Always a pleasure to have a chat with you, Liam, and keep up the great work.